Marcus adjusted the strap of his audio recorder, checking the levels as he stepped off the gravel road and onto the overgrown logging trail leading up Gallows Hill. As a local historian, he had spent the last month cataloging municipal tall tales for his audio series, Valley Chronicles. Tonight's objective was simple: walk up to the infamous timber frame structure at the summit, debunk the century-old rumors of curses, and head back down in time for diner coffee. Except, the mountain seemed determined to make his job difficult before he even cleared the tree line. Halfway up the slope, an unnatural quiet descended. The chattering blue jays and rustling squirrels vanished so abruptly it felt like someone had flipped a switch. The air grew heavy, smelling faintly of ozone and stagnant damp earth. By the time Marcus crossed a moss-covered boundary stone embedded in the roots of an ancient oak, the forest was entirely devoid of life. No insects, no wind in the canopy, just the heavy scuff of his own hiking boots against the dirt. Elevation threshold reached, Marcus muttered into his lapel mic, trying to shake a sudden prickling sensation at the back of his neck. Wildlife density drops to 0. Local superstition suggests a boundary. Science suggests a localized microclimate shift. He kept climbing, though his breath turned ragged faster than the slope warranted. At the summit, breaking through a thicket of thorn-choked brush, he found it. The municipal archives had called it the Gallows, but it bore little resemblance to historical execution sites. It was a massive, skeletal scaffolding of blackened, weather-beaten timber, perched precariously over the jagged lip of a deep, natural limestone fissure that plunged straight down into the mountain's core. Marcus set up his tripod, mounting a directional mic aimed down the gaping black throat of the fissure. The structure appears to be mid-19th century industrial framing, he reported to the blinking red light of the camera. Possibly used for mining extraction, though local lore insists criminals were dropped into the chasm. Let's test the acoustics. He dropped a loose pebble into the dark. It didn't clatter. It didn't bounce. It hit something wet, and a low, resonant groan reverberated up through the soles of his boots. A sound that felt less like stone shifting and more like a massive collective exhale. Marcus froze. He checked his audio monitor. The waveform wasn't picking up a mechanical bounce. It was visualizing a jagged, pulsing rhythm, perfectly matching the erratic thumping of his own terrified heart. Fear, cold and sharp, flooded his chest. "Get out!" a voice screamed in his mind. But it wasn't his voice. It was a harsh, gravelly internal warning that sounded disturbingly like his estranged brother. A man Marcus hadn't spoken to in 5 years, a man he secretly, bitterly wished would just disappear. Marcus spun around, dropping his mic. The clearing behind him was empty. Yet painted vividly against the gray bark of the nearest pine tree, he saw a fleeting phantom image of his brother, bleeding on a kitchen floor, framed in agonizing clarity. He stumbled backward, clutching his head. The archives hadn't spoken of ghosts. The old newspaper clippings from 1888 hadn't described restless spirits of the hanged. They spoke of settlers who walked up sane and came down raving murderers, claiming the mountain remembered what they hated most. The limestone fissure beside him seemed to pulse, its dark walls glistening with a slick, translucent film. It wasn't haunted. The mountain was a living geological archive of dark tissue and sentient stone, drinking in the ambient malice of the valley below and projecting it back with terrifying physical weight. A second image bloomed in the air before him, his own face, twisted in a cruel, unrecognizable smear, holding a heavy iron ledger over the abyss. Marcus turned and bolted down the trail, running blindly through the dead woods. But the forest floor felt soft, yielding beneath his boots, like walking across the skin of something breathing. Marcus stumbled over a swollen tree root that felt unnervingly like a flexed muscle. He caught himself against a massive pine, his palms scraping against bark that was far too warm. The spongy earth beneath his boots contracted, actively resisting his stride. Every panicked step forward required peeling his soles from the clinging, damp soil. He forced his gaze down the trail, desperate for the safety of the gravel road. Instead, the path twisted inward, the trees bending at unnatural angles to form a suffocating tunnel. The air grew thick, carrying the distinct, sharp scent of rubbing alcohol and old hospital linen, the exact smell of the waiting room the night his father passed away. A shape tore itself from the muddy bank ahead. It was not a spirit. It was an extrusion of dirt, root, and gray rock, snapping together in jerky, spasmodic bursts. The mound shifted, solidifying into a crude, faceless imitation of a hospital bed, entirely blocking the narrow descent. Marcus recognized the anomaly instantly. It was the guilt he carried for leaving his family that night, pulled directly from his own mind and constructed from the mountain's raw materials. To bypass the barrier, Marcus realized he had three grim options. He chose the third option. Marcus clamped his hands over his head, squeezing his eyes shut. He tried to flood his thoughts with mundane data, to starve the environment of his fear. Think about the audio gear, he demanded of himself. Think about the camera batteries. The air temperature dropped sharply. A harsh cracking noise snapped through the woods, resembling drying mud breaking apart under a hot sun. Marcus opened his eyes. The earthen structure had crumbled into a pile of ordinary, lifeless dirt, leaving the path clear. He scrambled over the loose rocks, his lungs burning as he pushed further down the slope, knowing the mountain would extract another dark thought before he reached the bottom. How far down the trail do you think Marcus needs to go before the mountain's influence entirely fades? Marcus threw himself forward, sprinting down the steep pitch of the path as the trees pressed in closer. The canopy overhead blocked out what little moonlight remained, plunging the trail into absolute blackness. He fumbled in his jacket pocket, his trembling fingers wrapping around his flashlight. He pulled it out, thumbed the power switch, and thrust the beam ahead. The light cut through the gloom, but it did not reveal the gravel road. Instead, the beam caught a wide, shallow pool of water spanning the width of the trail. The surface was perfectly smooth, acting like a dark mirror. Marcus skidded to a halt, his boots carving deep ruts into the wet mud. He stared down at the pool, his breath coming in ragged, whistling gasps. Reflected in the water was not his own panicked face, but a younger version of himself, 12 years old, standing in the cramped kitchen of his childhood home. In the reflection, his hand was raised, holding a heavy glass pitcher, bringing it down hard against the counter in a blind fit of childhood rage. It was a memory he had buried so deeply he had genuinely forgotten it, a malicious act of destruction directed at his mother that he had blamed on an intruder decades ago. The mountain was digging deeper. It was no longer content with recent resentments. It was excavating his foundational sins. A ripple disturbed the water's surface, though there was no wind. The reflection of the younger Marcus turned its head away from the shattered glass and looked straight up out of the pool, staring directly into the real world with dead black eyes. A hand of compacted mud and wet leaves broke the surface of the puddle, fingers clawing at the air inches from Marcus's shins. Marcus backed away, his heel catching on a jagged rock. He fell hard onto his back, the breath driven from his lungs in a sharp gasp. He scrambled backward on his elbows, kicking out blindly as the muddy hand pulled more of an arm from the water, dragging a heavy, sodden weight upward. The mud form was rising out of the pool, taking on the distorted shape of a small child made entirely of soil and decaying organic matter. It let out a wet, gurgling sound that mimicked the crying of a terrified boy, weaponizing his own guilt against him. Marcus rolled onto his stomach, pushing himself up, despite the searing pain in his bruised tailbone. He did not look back at the pool. He threw himself down the descending grade, arms flailing as he slid through a steep patch of loose shale. The air grew slightly cooler, carrying a faint, distant hint of exhaust fumes and asphalt. The road had to be close, but as he ran, the ground beneath his feet began to thrum with a heavy, coordinated pulse, matching the rhythm of a massive heartbeat, echoing upward from the deep limestone fissure far behind him at the summit. The mountain was not letting its guest leave easily. The trees lining the trail began to lean inward, their thick branches interlocking overhead like a cage closing from above. Marcus lunged through the narrowing arch of interlocking branches, throwing his shoulder against a thick pine bough that whipped across the path. The wood felt rigid and unyielding, like bone. The canopy overhead snapped shut completely, cutting off the last sliver of gray sky and plunging the trail into a suffocating, pitch-black tunnel. He kept his hands outstretched, his fingertips grazing the rough bark of the trees as he ran blindly forward. The rhythmic thrumming beneath his boots grew louder, vibrating through his teeth and rattling his skull. It was a dense physical pressure that pushed against his chest with every step, making it nearly impossible to draw a full breath. A sharp snap echoed directly behind him. Marcus risked a glance over his shoulder, sweeping his flashlight beam backward. The tunnel of trees was shifting. The roots lining the earth were pulling free from the soil, writhing like thick segmented cables as they whipped across the path, weaving together into a dense barrier that was rapidly sealing off the way he had just fled. The mountain was actively erasing the trail behind him, leaving only one direction to go. Forward, he told himself, his voice lost in the roaring thrum of the earth. Just keep moving forward. The asphalt scent grew sharper, cutting through the damp smell of rotting leaves. Through a final gap in the writhing wooden cage ahead, Marcus saw the pale, flat gray of the gravel road, illuminated by the distant highway lamps beyond the tree line. Safety was less than 50 yards away. Suddenly, the ground directly in front of him dropped out. Marcus scrambled to check his momentum, his boots skidding across the slick edge of a fresh, yawning trench that cut horizontally across the path. The pit was 6 feet wide and impossibly deep, its sheer earthen walls pulsing with a wet, bioluminescent sheen. At the bottom, a mass of tangled roots writhed and coalesced into a familiar silhouette, his own figure, trapped face down in the mud, staring up with lifeless eyes. The mountain was offering him a final choice: face the manifestation of his own demise, or find a way across the chasm before the closing canopy traps him here forever. Marcus slammed his palms into the damp earth at the very brink of the trench, his legs dangling over the dark abyss. Below him, the soil-crafted replica of his own body twitched, its head turning upward with a wet, tearing sound of parting clay. There was no time to hesitate. The canopy above had finished weaving its final suffocating roof, plunging the entire trail into an absolute, lightless shadow. Behind him, the sound of the wooden cage sealing shut was a deafening roar of snapping branches and grinding bark. Driven by raw panic, Marcus hauled his weight backward, ignoring the sharp stones biting into his palms, and lunged across the 6-foot gap. He didn't make it cleanly. His chest slammed hard against the opposite lip of the trench, the impact driving the last remnants of air from his lungs. His legs flailed uselessly over the void, his boots brushing against the reaching, mud-caked fingers of the figure below. With a guttural cry, Marcus clawed at the soil, his fingers sinking deep into the loose earth. He dragged his torso forward, kicking his legs frantically, until his boots found solid ground. He scrambled onto his hands and knees, vomiting bile onto the leaves as his body shook violently. Ahead of him, the wall of writhing trees parted. The pale glow of the municipal highway lamps washed over the final stretch of the logging trail, spilling across the gravel road just beyond the tree line. Marcus didn't look back. He scrambled to his feet and sprinted the remaining distance, bursting out of the dense brush and tumbling headfirst onto the hard, neutral asphalt of the road. He rolled onto his back, gasping great, burning lungfuls of clean, exhaust-laced air. The heavy, rhythmic thrumming of the mountain stopped instantly, cutting off as if an electrical switch had been thrown. The woods behind him fell into a heavy, ordinary stillness, the trees standing tall and rigid in the moonlight, looking entirely harmless. Marcus pushed himself up, leaning heavily against the metal guardrail of the highway. His phone, retrieved from his jacket with trembling fingers, displayed a single bar of service and the correct time. He looked down at his audio recorder dangling from his strap. The red light was still blinking. With a shaking thumb, he pressed play, leaning close to the small speaker to hear what the device had captured at the summit. Instead of the static or the sound of the wind he expected, the tiny speaker played back a low, contented hum, followed by the clear, distinct sound of a door unlatching from deep within his own house back in town. Marcus stared at the blinking red light of the recorder, his blood running colder than the mountain air. The contented hum faded, replaced by the unmistakable sound of floorboards creaking in his hallway, specifically the loose board right outside his guest bedroom. The mountain hadn't just recorded his dark impulses, it had harvested them, packaged them, and sent them home ahead of him. He didn't wait for a rideshare or bother turning his car on. Marcus sprinted the remaining 2 miles down the winding highway toward his neighborhood, his lungs burning, driven by a frantic desperation to beat whatever had crossed the threshold of his front door. When he finally reached his street, the familiar 2-story house sat dark and quiet beneath the streetlights. Every window was pitch black, but as he sprinted up the concrete steps, he noticed the front door was ajar, just a fraction of an inch, exactly as the audio had portended. He pushed the door open, his hand trembling as he fumbled for the light switch. The overhead fixture buzzed to life, casting a harsh yellow glare over the entryway. Standing at the end of the short hallway, silhouetted against the open door of the guest room, was a figure. It wore his jacket, carried his exact weight, and had his face, twisted into that same cruel, unrecognizable sneer he had seen projected against the pine trees at the summit. The reflection spoke, its voice a hollow, flat echo of his own. "You left the back door unlocked," the copy said, taking a slow step forward. Marcus reached out, his fingers brushing the interior doorframe as reality fractured. He realized then that the mountain was never a geological anomaly trapped on Gallows Hill. It was a doorway, and he had just brought it all the way home.